Can you hear me, everyone? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Valeriano Ramos with Everyday Democracy, and I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for what will be a wonderful talk and discussion, Citizen Demos, Revisiting Democracy. This event will consist of a talk followed by a very short break, and then after that we'll have a 1-hour dialogue session or discussion. Please abstain from asking questions at the beginning while our guest speaker is speaking. You'll have the chance to ask the questions later during the discussion session, so make sure you jot down your questions so that you don't forget them. Okay. Also, as a courtesy to our speaker, please let's make sure that our phones are on vibration mode. And if you need to use the restrooms, they're walking down the hall to the right after the stairs. You'll see them right there as well. So now, before I introduce our distinguished guest speaker, I want to acknowledge and thank Connecticut Humanities for supporting this program with a grant, and also the Hartford Public Library for co-sponsoring it and providing this wonderful space for us to use. So thank you to the library, and also thank you to Liz Castle, who is our technician, who is also helping us today. So thank you, Liz. This event is part of the Connecticut Civic Health Project. Those of you who don't know, the project has been around since 2011, and it's an effort to really document the state of civic participation in Connecticut, document research and data as a way to help us understand how are people getting engaged in their communities, volunteering, voting, meeting with public officials, engaged in discussions on issues, things like that. And so the Civic Health Project aims at supporting more of that to happen in our state so that we strengthen our communities and our democracy. And we have with us today, in fact, a member of the Civic Health Advisory Group, Sally Whipple, from the Connecticut Old State House, who is the Executive Director. So Sally, thanks for being here as well. This program is also co-sponsored by the Connecticut Civic Ambassadors, and we are also fortunate to have a couple of them here. Mr. Ferens, who's sitting over there, and Sally also is a Civic Ambassador, as I am as well. And the Civic Ambassadors program was started in December of last year. The idea behind that is to have more people who are out there in their local towns and communities, encouraging others to be engaged and participate in civic activities. And to also create opportunities for civic participation where that's not available. And as part of the Civic Ambassadors, this is part of the series to inform the way that civic ambassadors can be more effective at really advocating on behalf of supporting a stronger democracy and stronger community through civic participation and citizenship. Okay? So at this point, I want to introduce our guest speaker. And for me, it's a privilege to introduce Mr. Ashok Panikkar, whose bio is rather extensive. If I were to read his bio, it would take probably the whole 45 minutes. So I encourage you to check his website, ashokpanikkar.com, ASHOKPANIKKAR. Okay, and I'm sure he'll mention that later again. So that has quite a wealth of information about the great work he's been doing, not only here in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of the world. Ashok has a master's degree in critical and creative thinking from the University of Massachusetts, and did his undergraduate studies in visual communication from the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, India. He has advanced training in negotiation, dialogue facilitation, and conflict resolution from different leading institutes in the United States and the UK, including CDR in Boulder, Colorado, Mediation Works, Inc. in Boston, Massachusetts, Facing History and Ourselves, also in Boston, the Public Conversations Project in Watertown, Massachusetts, Partnership Brokers in the United Kingdom, and the Program of Negotiation at the Harvard Law School. So as you can see, he's very, very trained in conflict management and resolution. But he's also presented numerous papers at professional conferences worldwide, and most recently at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Cardozo Law School in New York City, and that will happen in November of last year. And that's among other talks that he has given all over the world. Ashok also writes a blog on democracy called Rights, Slides, and Free Lunches, Notes from Ages of Democracy. I encourage you to check out his blog, and I'm sure he'll give you more information about that later on. Over the past 2 decades, he has worked and experimented extensively to strengthen the culture of democracy in communities and organizations throughout the world by modeling effective collaborative practices, creative problem solving, and critical thinking. Among the various projects that he has developed, ventures that he has advanced include the Human Intelligence Project between 2013 and 2016, Alternatives Futures Dialogues and Leadership Dialogue in 2016, which is a 7-month program that he sponsored. Socrates' Last Stand in 2015 and 16, and Metaculture from 2005 to the present, among others. Ashok is founder of Metaculture, Designing for Democracy, which is a laboratory for honest dialogue, critical thinking, creativity, and personal and group transformation. Ashok will mention Metaculture on his website during the talk as well. In July of 2016, troubled by the rise of authoritarianism, the European refugee crisis, Brexit, and extreme polarization in the US, he started Citizen Demos, Cultivating the Democratic Mind, as an initiative to strengthen the values and culture of democratic societies using vital lessons from the humanities and the liberal arts. Over the past year, Ashok has lectured on Citizen Demos, and he told me today he's done about 11 other talks, and this is the last one of the series of conversations and lectures he's given on the topic of Citizen Demos. And he's done that in various cities in the Northeast, including Washington, D.C., Boston, New York City, and now here in Connecticut. It is a privilege, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the distinguished speaker and my friend Ashok Panikkar. Please welcome Ashok.
Hello, hello. Could I ask you to come this way? I can't see you there. I think it's kind of a toss-up as to whether you want a large group where you really can't see individual faces, or whether it's a small group where you can really pay attention to everyone. The only problem is it kind of feels awkward standing here and talking to a small group. So you will bear with my awkwardness, and we will try to have as much of a meaningful, and I hate to say fun, but let's try to kind of enjoy what is otherwise quite a challenging situation that we are in. So again, thank you really for coming here today. And before we get started, can I just, through a show of hands, get some responses? How many of you are very, very concerned about issues related to race? Race. Thank you. How many of you are really concerned about issues related to gender? How many of you are really, really concerned about issues related to immigration and, immigrants? Okay, good. How many of you are really, really concerned about climate change? Good. Pretty much most hands came up for most things. Depending on the group, sometimes some of these themes attract a certain kind of person, and the other themes attract another kind. Today, we are not going to look at any of those issues that we have talked about. You might ask why? Because these are pressing issues. And it's for a very simple reason. There are enough organizations and enough people really, really paying attention to issues of gender, race, immigration, sexuality, etc., all of which are very, very important issues. Today, I would like us to pay attention to something that very few people pay attention to, and that is the state and fate of our political system. This is different from specific issues. So let's see how that unfolds, shall we? So I'm calling this talk Reimagining and Rethinking Democracy, because democracy is such a word. Everybody knows it. And everybody's got opinions on it. And over the last 3 years, I have been talking to, I mean, it's really no exaggeration, 3 to 5 years, I have been talking to people about democracy in many, many countries. And one of the most astonishing things that I've discovered is nobody can agree on what democracy is, but we are all very clear that we have it or that it's not working. Everybody's got opinions on it. Now, what I'm hoping we can do today is give some texture and color to how we understand democracy. Okay? So, I thought a good way of getting started with this topic of democracy is to start from a very personal place. So I call it, I call it a love story with democracy, and I'll talk about it from my personal experience. I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s in India. Anyone who knows anything about that part of the world in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, it was desperately poor, particularly the 60s and 70s. I was lucky I came from a middle-class family, but still, like for instance, we couldn't afford good jeans until the 90s. Okay? So just to give, I mean, you had to wait for 10 to 12 years to buy a car, if you could afford it. So it's a very poor country. But guess what? It was a free country. It was a democracy. And the funny thing about it was, despite the fact that it was a poor country, despite the fact that it was traditional and feudalistic and all that, every person in India was theoretically free, at least theoretically, and every person could advocate for what they believed in, even if the police was completely corrupt and the judiciary was completely slow. In general, we had rights. If the media got wind of something terrible that was happening, they could talk about it, and sometimes very, very poor people got justice. It was a liberal, secular democracy. Now, I grew up in that. And then something happened. Because it was such a poor country, my dad, who was an accountant, he had 3 kids, and another 5 years they would go to college. He didn't feel he could afford to pay for college for 3 kids. So he decided to take a job in the Middle East. He went to Dubai. Dubai was known in those days as, and even today, as one of the most liberal Arab states. And in the beginning, because I was an adolescent, I loved it because guess what? We got real Coke, not the, really cheap, knockoff that we found in India. I got to buy jeans, real jeans, the kind that I saw in comic books, that Archie and, these people were wearing. I got to buy nice watches and electronics. So the first 2 years, and my whole family was so enamored with life in Dubai, until I started recognizing something, that there was one major intangible difference. Tangible difference that wasn't very visible. The newspapers were completely bland, and nobody criticized the government, and nobody criticized the dominant group or the dominant religion at all. Forget criticize. You couldn't even talk about anything remotely contentious. And listening to my parents talk, we would hear about people they knew or had heard of who were whisked away in the middle of the night or sometimes in broad daylight and were never heard of again. And over a 10-year period, my parents lived in Dubai, they lived in Kuwait, they lived in Abu Dhabi, and I saw how absolutely without dignity most people, other than the local population, lived. I saw CEOs of companies, if they were from immigrants, being whisked off again in the middle of the night and in jail without any charges for years on end. And I realized the way my dad, who was a professional, was treated very often. He was treated as a fourth-class citizen. Fourth class. I remember once, because he was a pretty well-qualified accountant, he went for an interview, and when they asked him, they liked him, they wanted to hire him. And when they asked him how much he wanted, he mentioned a figure which was about 20% more than what he was making. And the man who was interviewing him literally went back on his chair and he said, "You must be kidding." And my dad said, "No, I'm making X and I'd like X plus 2. And he said, "But for that money, I could get an Englishman from England. Why do I need to hire an Indian?" And then when my dad looked at him, kind of stupefied, he didn't know what to say. He said, "Oh, no, I'm not a racist, but you do understand how things work here." And he said, the highest salaries are for local, meaning Emirati, citizens of Emirates and who are Muslim. The second are for other Arabs who are Muslim. The third are for Muslims from non-Arab countries. And the fourth are for Arabs who are, the fourth are for white folks from UK and US. And the fifth are for non-English speaking Western Europeans. And way down the list come brown non-Muslims. And this was, short of an official policy, completely understood conventional wisdom. And that's the way the society operated. So by the time I was in my 20s, I started becoming extraordinarily conscious of the advantages of living in a poor country, as long as it was democratic. And when I was looking for a job, and because my parents were in the Middle East, I kind of went there for about 10 short of a year, and I ran away because as an adult, I really felt unsafe on the streets. Not that there was any mugging. The police are so efficient. The streets are physically safe. But if you're not a local Arab or Muslim, then you feel that in your veins. And I went back to India to start my career. So I just want to say this because that's when I really, really became conscious of this. I want to kind of turn back a couple of few years, and for those of you who are aware of history, you've heard of, or recent history, have you heard of one of India's prime ministers, Mrs. Indira Gandhi? Okay, she wasn't a relative of Gandhi. She was our first Prime Minister Nehru's daughter. So she was a prime minister. She was a very popular prime minister until she became unpopular. And when she became unpopular, she, in a fit of frustration and anger, decided to introduce martial law. And she called it the emergency. And for 2 years, India, which was one of the most successful democracies in the developing world, lost its democracy between 1975 and 1977. So that's when I was in college, and I was so conscious of what it was. And I had a personal experience of this. One of my classmates, his parents, both father and mother, were opposition leaders who were arrested at midnight in I think it was July 23rd, 1977, and they were both imprisoned for 2 years. And the entire, I mean, there was no word from his parents. So because he was my classmate, we would literally experience what it was for someone to run afoul of the government. No habeas corpus was banned or removed. So nobody could even ask questions of the government. Now, fast forward. In 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the coming down of the Berlin Wall, everybody thought, oh my God, this is fantastic. Now, liberal democracy is the norm. Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, thinking that's it, there are no more ideological struggles. Now the world is ready for democracy and capitalism. Well, since then, despite some very significant advancement of democracy, particularly in Eastern Europe, particularly over the last 10 years, things have been changing. Things have been changing. And I would like to start talking about, and this is what I call the crisis of liberal democracy, and I'll explain to you why the word liberal is also very important here. Even though I know that for many people the word liberal is a very confusing one because it's linked with neoliberalism and many other ugly and problematic ideas. But I want to try and recapture the essence of some of these words that we have actually either taken for granted or we have started misunderstanding or even abusing. Okay? So I'd like to look at the idea of freedom and rights. Think back. At what point in human history did society start granting individuals rights? And at what point in human history did societies guarantee rights for anyone? 1,000 years ago? 500 years ago? Anybody? And yes. Thank you. Thank you. So the Magna Carta, if we trace the history of freedom, we have to link it to the limitations on the power of rulers. Because freedom from whom? Freedom from the people who are in power, exercising total power over you. Okay? Now, starting from the Magna Carta, but that was limited to the aristocracy. The aristocracy decided they didn't want to be bullied by the monarch, so they had an arrangement about it. But if you really think about ordinary people like you and me, it was only, it became even remotely universal only in the mid to late 19th century in some Western countries. And even that, only in some Western countries, and that too for limited sections of the population. So in the US, for instance, women didn't have the vote and didn't have complete rights at multiple levels. African Americans didn't have. If you were not white and Christian, you didn't have a lot of rights in the US. The same is true in every other Western country. Only a limited number of people had rights. Guess when it truly tried to become universal? After the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and post-World War II. So if you really think about it, as a species, we've been around for a couple of 100 million years. As developed societies, I don't know, would you say 5 to 10,000 years? And it's only in 50 to 60 years that the idea that each one of us, no matter what our background, no matter how marginal we might be in the societal structure, at least had a theoretical, hypothetical possibility of autonomy, individual autonomy and dignity, which is what rights are. That the state or a criminal cannot just walk into my house and do what he wants. The reason why this is significant is it is so new, there is no way we can take it for granted. It is so new that there is no way we can assume that this is the normal way in which human societies function. I was talking to Sally just before this started, and I said, I'll be honest, my main goal here is to terrify all of you. You see, and I say this because most of my friends, I mean, in the US, pretty much most of my friends are Americans, and they're very liberal, and they're such positive, optimistic people. They want to see the sunny side of things. And I don't have to do that because I'm not American. I am freed of a sunny disposition. I can afford to look at things without rose-tinted glasses. It doesn't mean I'm right, but it's an opportunity for me to give you another perspective. And the fact of the matter is, it is what the freedoms we have and the rights we have are extraordinarily tenuous. And in the work that I've been doing, I'm also realizing that it's completely dependent on the political system that a country has. Now, since then, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, and the reports of the newspapers and the televisions talk of this all the time, but I'm not sure we understand its significance. The whole world has changed. This is not the world of the 1990s or even the 1970s. This is, I don't want to say post-democracy, but it's definitely a world where alternate forms of government are becoming credible. China is actively trying to demonstrate in most parts of the world that you don't need a democracy, you don't need freedom of expression, you don't have to give individual rights to people, you can still keep people happy by providing them jobs and physical safety and national pride. Before China became this way, Singapore was doing a very good job of that. Singapore is a city-state, but there's no freedom of expression. The opposition is a shell opposition. The same party rules all the time, and they win about 95% or 98% of all the seats, and you cannot criticize the government at all. And Singapore was has one of the highest standards of living, demolishing the myth that you need a democracy for a very successful economy. So here's the other thing. Democracy and capitalism have been conflated in most of our minds. So the moment we talk of democracy, people talk about, oh, but how terrible capitalism is and globalization. Part of what I want to do is separate them. Not that there aren't interconnections. Capitalism at many levels derives from the idea of individual property rights. So these connections are there, but that doesn't mean we have to conflate them. India is a great example of democracy until 1991 with a socialist system of government. We had a very active democracy. We didn't have a free market capitalist society. And China is a great example of capitalism without democracy. Singapore, capitalism without democracy. So I think it's very important for us to start separating these, because it's kind of like studying a chemical or something. You have to break it down into its components to really understand it. Then you can put it back and see it in a holistic fashion. 5 wonderful names: Xi, Putin, Erdogan, Orban, and Modi. You will hear them. You will hear a lot of them for the next 10 years until one of them pops it, but the next person who comes is probably going to be even more of an authoritarian than these people. And they are extraordinarily popular in their countries. And they have phenomenal credibility, unlike Western leaders. This is scary. If our role models are authoritarian figures who do not respect human rights, we have to really be concerned. one of the most wonderful things, and I first came to the US in 95 and I lived for 10 years in Boston, and now I've been back for about a year and a half. And there's a reason why I come to the US, and I like, by and large, I like living here. It's because, particularly 95 to 2005, I found this to be the most creative and open place I had ever been in the world. Little different now. I find Americans far more closing, far more troubled, afraid, untrusting, and even very angry. None of which works if you want to be creative and innovative. You cannot be creative and closed. You can't be afraid and creative. You can't be untrusting and averse to risk-taking and closed. Okay, so, but my experience from 95 to 2005, and because I'm a big fan of American literature and American innovation, I have always been astounded by the level of creativity this country has. Having said that, when I talk with my American friends, and they're all very politically active, most of them, or at least their interests are political, there is a way in which they see America as different and exceptional, and they look at everything that happens in this country from an American lens. And that may have worked in the past, but today, America is as much dependent on the rest of the world. I don't mean economically alone. It is completely dependent on the major changes that are happening in the world, because those are affecting the US too. Trump is not an American phenomenon. Trump is a global phenomenon. The rise of the right wing, not American, it's global. Fake news, not American, global. The problems that America has right now cannot have American solutions alone. We need democratic solutions that borrow and learn from other democratic societies. This is very critical. And American exceptionalism, while I do appreciate it in spirit at multiple levels, I don't think it extends to its political situation today. Part of this global shift, of course, is the extraordinary intolerance and repression happening all over the world. Those of you who are aware of Freedom House, just to give one source, Freedom House, based in DC, does every year they do a kind of a dipstick on democracy. And for the past 17 years, democracy has been losing losing ground. The past 10 years, it has accelerated. And over the last couple of years, they have downgraded American. Before Trump, they were downgrading American democracy. Before Trump. So I tell this to many of my friends who are so mad with Trump. Say, you have a right to be mad with Trump, but he's not the problem. He's just a symptom of the problem. And we need to really get to the roots, because getting rid of Trump might be emotionally satisfying for many people, and it might solve one or two specific problems, but the larger problems will not just continue, but they can get exacerbated. So in other words, if instead of Trump, if we had a person with similar power, and who was very strategic about changing everything rather than impulsive, and rather than tweeting if he worked the system very assiduously, we'd all be in trouble. Rethinking democracy. Again, as I said, we need to, and I've already talked about the first thing, we need to separate the economic system from the political system. And they are always connected, but they are not the same. And you cannot talk about democracy as always linked with capitalism. Okay? Second, democracy is usually understood as majoritarianism. If everybody votes for it, then that's the law. And that's what the Hindu nationalists are doing today. After 70 years of having a reasonably robust democracy, they are saying, well, if most of the Hindus wanted this way, the country must go this way because it's a popular will. That's what a democracy is. This is one of the tragedies of democracy. We have not understood it correctly, and we have assumed that democracy is essentially elections. There's a huge problem with that idea. Here's what an election is. It's merely a mechanism to select representatives who can represent the views of that particular constituency in the decision-making forum. That's all elections do. It's a mechanical device. Maybe because of the internet or technology, in another 10 to 15 years, we'll have different kinds of mechanisms. But in the industrial age, this was an effective mechanism. That's all it is. Okay? And democracy essentially, and there are many ways we can look at it, but there are 2 to 3 things that are very important. One, it's self-government. It means that the people are the ones who are involved in ruling themselves, as opposed to an aristocracy or a monarchy or a family that carries power down the ages. The people have the right to either directly rule or rule through somebody of their choosing. The second is rule of law. It's not Modi's or Putin's opinions that matter. It's the law of the land. And the third thing, which is very important, and that's where the importance of humanities, the importance of liberalism, and the values of enlightenment are there. It is not the collective or the group norms that determine how democracy works. It's individual rights. This is hugely important in traditional societies where the group is more important than the individual. I grew up in a system where you've all heard of the caste system. You've all heard of arranged marriages. Some of you may have heard of people being killed because they married from the wrong group. Women being killed because they had an affair or stoned to death or whatever. Most traditional societies operate on the power and norms set out by the group. Democracy coming out of the Enlightenment was based on the idea of reason, very imperfectly, but still the idea of reason. And reason can never be a group's reason. It has to be an individual's reason. In other words, what happens in your mind as you wrestle with an idea and you try to understand the facts for yourself and you come up with a thought or an opinion that has value, not merely because you heard it from your elders or your clergy and therefore you accept it as the truth. So it's a dramatic shift in the way human beings started understanding themselves and society. So the values of the Enlightenment, even if we today equate it with white male-centric thinking or we equate it with capitalism, and those connections are there, but it is not the whole story. It's very important to recognize where we got these ideas of an individual's power or autonomy. And but for that, we wouldn't have got it. And therefore, democracy, as we understand it today, comes out of the values of, in our academic institutions, we call it the humanities, but it's critical thinking, it's history, it's philosophy, it's literature, it's sociology, and all these sciences and arts that help us understand who we are as individuals and as societies and as groups and how we engage with each other. My own field of conflict resolution is deeply rooted in the humanities and the Enlightenment. Because guess what? And I discovered this when I went to India in 2005 to set up metaculture. I went out of idealism because I thought India needs conflict resolution, and I thought this is the best way to do it. And very soon I realized Indians don't want to negotiate. We don't want dialogue. We don't want to listen to anybody who doesn't agree with us. And they wanted me, the mediator, to tell them what to do. Because these are authoritarian, autocratic, feudalistic societies, where if you had a problem, you went to the elder or the most powerful person and asked them for a solution. And either you try to influence the person in power or you bribe them to get the result you wanted. The idea that people can sit around and the highest person and the lowest person, economically or in terms of status, can engage as equals in order to come up with a solution that worked for them is anathema. It is unthinkable, even amongst the most educated people. I did this for 12 years in India and I gave up. I really gave up. And it was heartbreaking because I never thought I would leave India when I went in 2005, and I really wanted to build an institution that could do this work because India needs it so desperately. But I gave up because I didn't feel I could do this. Anyway, so this brings us to a last very important aspect of democracy, and of late I've been talking about this a lot. When we talk about democracy, we normally think in terms of the institutions. So the separation of powers, very strong, neutral judiciary, and enlightened leaders. And don't we all love it when an Obama shows up? Okay? We somehow think as long as we have a savior who is wonderful and has our political values, life will be wonderful. Well, this is a huge fallacy. Democracy should not be dependent on either the institutions or on extraordinary leaders. It should depend on you, each one of us, and the values we bring to the table. Here's something. Has anyone heard of someone called Mac Maharaj? He was Nelson Mandela's one of his closest associates, and he was in Robben Island in the prison with him for about many, many years. He was also famous for having smuggled Mandela's autobiography page by page outside. Okay, so this man, a senior ANC leader, I heard him talk quite recently, and he said something very, very powerful. He said, when people look at South Africa today, they are very, very disappointed because after the transition of power from the Afrikaners to the ANC, and after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which everybody, including particularly people in my field of conflict resolution, love to talk about, he says, things are really bad. And people are now blaming democracy. And he said in public, he said, the problem was not democracy. We, the people, are the problem. We failed democracy. Think about this for a minute. What does that mean? How can the citizens fail democracy? Leaders, yes. Nixon, oh my God, what a betrayal. For those who, are from the progressive or left-wing or liberal, George Bush, how terrible, okay? But the people, how can the people fail a democracy? We will come back to this, but here's the key. In a democracy, we have to start by building a democracy from the bottom up. In other words, the values and the behaviors of individual citizens. And if you don't have a strong, democratically oriented and thinking citizenry, any demagogue, any corrupt politician, or the natural decay of institutions can destroy democracy. No, you don't even need bad people to destroy democracy. Are you familiar with the idea of entropy? Everything in nature tends towards disorder. All human structures and institutions also tend towards disorder. There is no perfect, consistently sustainable system. You're all part of at least families, You're all affiliated with some kind of institution, either studying or working or leading institutions. Well, guess what? You know how much effort it takes to manage and to sustain the family or the team or the institution. And it's not just about getting money. All human systems are extraordinarily vulnerable and very, very susceptible to decay or corruption. Democracy, I like to use this because as a conflict resolution person, I'm always working with relationships. It's relationships between landlords and tenants, or husbands and wives, or groups, you know, an environmental group versus a polluting company. So those are the groups that I work with. And I like to think of democracy, a democratic society, as nothing but the largest relationship you can be part of. It is a relationship. Now, if you were in China, there is no relationship except between you and the government. If you are in Saudi Arabia, there is no relationship except between you and the government. But in a democracy, you have and must maintain the relationship with every person you come in touch with, starting with your neighbors, starting with the groups that you are part of, affinity groups, work groups, it doesn't matter what, because that is where democracy either strengthens or weakens. So after we rethink and re-understand democracy, we have to move to something else. We have to reimagine democracy as it can be, not the way it was. Because let's face it, it's a work in progress. And no country has gotten it right. I know that liberals and progressives love to look at Scandinavia and say, but they got it right. Yeah, right. If you make me president of Norway, I can get it right. 3 million people or 4 million people, and whew, what a great exchequer and treasury. I can run it. No, those are almost city-states with extraordinary resources. It's like Kuwait, until now things are getting bad, or Saudi. They could run very peaceful societies by giving money to people. Kuwait, the Arab Gulf was a welfare state. And until recently, no problems. Those are not genuine democracies. And by that I mean, yes, the Nordic countries are genuine democracies, but they are not a model for the rest of us. In other words, what works for them will not necessarily work for us because of scale, because of diversity. And as Sweden is discovering now, and Denmark is discovering with the Syrian refugees coming there. Both those countries are really struggling. And the right wing is growing in a very, very powerful way there. When I talk of values, I want to emphasize that essentially we need a culture of democracy. Think about it this way. I pose this question very often in my workshops. I say, if you were a citizen, and that word is not an accurate one, if you are in Saudi Arabia, you're a subject. Or in China, you're really not a citizen. But if you are an inhabitant of China, and you've lived there all your life, and let's just say at 40, you come to the US, do you have to change your behavior or the way you think in order to function as an American? Or can you be exactly the same kind of highly competent medical doctor or technician or whatever there, and you do the same work, you're an honest person, you pay taxes, you follow the American laws, and you become a citizen? I see some of you shaking your head. No, because in China or Saudi Arabia, all I have to do is follow the rules. And if I keep my nose out of the government's business, there's nothing else expected of me. Yes, I need to be a productive, economically productive person. But in a democracy, that's not enough. I have to contribute to the nurturing of that culture, nurturing of the democratic culture. Because democracy, once designed and put in place, does not continue until it needs to be constantly watered, and the ground needs to be tilled or irrigated. Otherwise, to use a crude analogy, instead of airy, nitrogen-rich soil, it bakes hard and becomes completely unfertile. The democracy needs its soil to be replenished. And as a citizen of a democracy, I have a vital function in doing that. I cannot delegate that to my government. Whereas all of us, including me, have always thought, if we had good leaders, if the government was clean, we would have a great life. Not in a democracy. In China, yes. Because Chinese government doesn't expect anything of me in terms of inputs or feedback about how they're doing. They don't care. Neither does Saudi Arabia. But in a democracy, I have the extraordinary right as an ordinary person to be part of the decision-making process. How much depends on me. I can stand for elections if I want. If not, I can actually be active in advocating and really trying to influence people who stand for elections. Or, even if I don't want to do that, I can at least be well informed about the issues in my community and my country so that I can't be manipulated by those who want to manipulate me. That is what creates a culture. So essentially, it's everyone's business, not just politicians. And you see, this doesn't happen. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Democracy requires hard work. And this is one reason why democracies collapse. Because guess what? How many do we have here? 11, out of which at least one person is the organizer, so we have 10 people. I know how much work Val has done and Everyday Democracy has done to put this together. We've been talking about it for a few months now. They had to raise money to get me here, and we get 10 people. It's not just here. I've been doing this for a year. And it's not just me. I can understand if people didn't want to come and hear me talk. But there are other people who are trying to do this who get similar receptions. Most people, and it's not because people are bad. It's because nobody has time. If you are doing 40 to 50 hours a week, if you have a family with 1 or 2 kids, and you have your yoga, and you have your errands and your groceries and everything else to do, you don't have time to take 2 hours to come for an event. Now guess what? It means that you are expecting someone else to keep this country democratic. And what we are experiencing here is played out by tens of thousands of NGOs and nonprofits that are doing this work across the country. They suffer from lack of engagement, lack of involvement. There is nothing more dangerous. So coming back to democratic values, establish the fact that people make a democracy. It's not the institutions, it's not the leaders. 2, values make the people. I cannot be a subject of Saudi Arabia or China or Singapore and hold those values and be effective as a citizen of the US or India or France. This is important to recognize. 3rd, what do we mean by values? The values of negotiation, the values of dialogue, the values of compromise, and most importantly, the recognition that I will never get everything that I want. And even things that are very important, that I deserve, I won't necessarily get it today. And guess what? The greatest promise that democracy makes is that if I don't get it today, I can come back tomorrow and ask for it. Democracy does not guarantee that I will get what I need or even what I deserve. But it means that I can keep trying. In most societies, you can't even keep trying. You open your mouth once, you keep it shut the rest of the time. You learn a lesson. This is a phenomenal aspect of democracy. And this brings us to something else. Democracy does not guarantee results. What democracy is a process, a system that if you engage with it constructively over a period of time, you get some of the results that you want. Why do I keep saying some? Because there are other people in a democracy not like you, and they want different things. You can't get everything you want in a democracy because some of the time you have to lose and somebody else needs a chance. I say this, I say you can't be a winner all the time in a democracy, which itself should tell us something about Trump's campaign slogan about winning all the time. There's a problem if you're winning all the time. What about those who don't? They have a right to gain some of the things that they don't have the power or the connections or the wealth. They too deserve to win sometimes. And they can't win sometimes if you don't win. I'm not saying everything is a zero-sum game, but everything isn't win-win either. And part of the values is the ability to think critically. Part of the value is the ability to be generous. And very important, very linked with critical thinking is mindfulness. And I don't mean this in any esoteric, religious, or spiritual way. I mean that you cannot be a good citizen unless you have all your antennae open. You can't be living in your cocoon or your bubble, happy with the things you read, happy with the music you listen to, and only talking to people on Facebook or face-to-face who agree with you. You have to pay attention. The one thing that I believe is most dangerous to democracy is digital technology, social media, because it destroys our capacity to pay attention. This is very, very scary. Hopefully, in our dialogue, when we go to the back, we can talk more about this. Okay, so I would love to have some questions. Let's take a few questions before we take a short break and then go to the dialogue. So, initial thoughts, that's a good way to start, even if you don't have any immediate profound questions to kick it off. But what's happening in your mind?
I'm very shocked at the turnout, when you mentioned how there are only 10 people here other than the person who started. I'm 29 years old. I was trying to invite some of my other friends to get involved and tried to even promote it on social media, on Facebook, and no one wanted to participate. And for me, I was a little embarrassed, just being the only one showing up. And I want to be more engaged and more involved.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I guess
It's a good wake-up call.
it is in a sense, and it's a very disturbing wake-up call. Maybe we should try an evening of cat videos, or the real problem with Trump, and everybody will come, you know. But unless it's sexy or it hits some of our hot buttons. So if I'm really troubled by race or gender, then I will show up for that, you know, but not otherwise. This is too abstract for most people, and unfortunately it's like a virus. You can't see it, but it's there, and finally that's what's going to kill you. Other thoughts?
So Ashok, when you talk about democracy as fertile ground that needs to be nourished, it reminds me of the work of Eric Klug, who wrote a book called The Gardens of Democracy. And we were very fortunate to bring Eric Klug a couple of years Salim was hosting us there,
Right.
and he talked about precisely what you said, but also the challenges to democracy through social change,
Right.
economic change, the eradication of the spaces where people can connect. The internet has actually in many ways divided
Absolutely.
people or atomizing people.
Right.
Whereas before people could gather at a market or could have town hall meetings or could have social gatherings at the family hardware store. Now they go to a mall where everybody's running around, you don't know the people next to you. So I encourage you to also read that book, The Gardens of Democracy by Eric Wu. It really complements very well what Ashok was doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Other thoughts? Just yes.
You gave a couple of examples where you said subjects from India or China, when they live there, they just, if they don't get involved with the government, they do fine. And when they come over here, they need to change. Do you think there's problems when Americans that are politically active here would move to China or India?
Oh,
Would there be difficulties?
absolutely. Because if you're an active, politically active person here, firstly, I can't imagine you surviving in China or Saudi Arabia. Like what happened to me in my early 20s or late teens and early 20s in the Middle East, it's like I felt I was walking around in chains. So if freedom of expression, if your personal dignity and autonomy are important, those are not the countries for you. One. Secondly, diversity is a really, really complex issue. I think very few people get it right. Especially progressives, we like to think, or liberals, we like to think that diversity is really good. But diversity works only if integration happens. So in other words, if I did this mind game in 2001 when I went back to India after about 6 years here. And because I was in the Boston area, most of my friends were flaming liberals. And I went to my parents' hometown. And one day, I was there for a couple of weeks. I was just walking, it's a quiet little neighborhood. And I was walking there and it occurred to me, what if I took 20 of my friends, lovely people from Cambridge and Arlington, and I brought them to this neighborhood, and they lived there for 6 months or 1 year. I felt afraid for my parents' neighborhood. These are lovely people, but culture is vital. The autonomy, the sense of whether it's gender or sexuality, or in terms of political ideas that Americans have, you transplant that into even a democratic society that is conservative and traditional, you will wreak havoc there. So, which is not to say that diversity is a problem. It works when you invest in managing it. If you just let loose, it's very dangerous. This is we were doing some work with the refugee problem in Europe, and one of the most disheartening aspects of how Europe is dealing with this issue is not restricting the refugees alone. It is all the investment is going towards accommodating them, meaning food, clothing, shelter, very important. After that, jobs, education, very important. Almost close to zero effort in genuinely trying to integrate people coming from a completely different value system into one of the most progressive, free-thinking, free-living societies on this planet. Dangerous, extremely dangerous. So, I mean, I have 20 years of experience as a diversity trainer and cross-cultural consultant. And I can tell you, diversity is complicated. Other thoughts?
You have to remember when we think of being immigrants coming to America, whichever way immigrants came to America, because only the whether that was a female or a male.
Right, right.
Okay, so.
Thank you for that. Makes me feel very happy. Want to keep me happy. At least for the next half an hour. After that, you don't really care. So what I'd like to do is get to know you. So can you all just introduce yourselves? And here's what would be good. One line about what you do or who you are that you want us to know. Just one line. Let's keep it quick.
My name is Annette Shack. I'm a retired teacher, and I'm also the vice president of the Greater Hartford NAACP.
Wonderful. Glad to see you.
My name is Linda Costin. I'm a retired State of Connecticut Economic Development employee, and I sit on the executive board of NAACP and a member of the National Council of Negro Women, both international organizations.
Welcome.
My name is Mara Parsai. I'm a volunteer engagement coordinator at the United Way of Greater New Haven, and I just moved here from Colorado.
Ah. Well, I guess welcome now in a really physical way.
Thank you.
My name is Sarah Wallace. I'm a student here in Hartford, and I'm a CNA at St. Francis Hospital, and also volunteer at Connecticut Children's.
Thank you.
My name is Tere Luna. I'm birth registrar, and I'm also participating with the Civic Ambassador as a Civic Ambassador.
And you're a musician,
Singer.
I'm a
Singer.
singer and dancer.
singer and dancer. Wonderful.
My name is Shruti. I'm a graduate student here at the University of Hartford, and I also work in the admissions department.
Ah,
My name is Samantha Gorski. I'm a museum educator over at the Old State House.
museum educator. Okay.
I'm Sally Whipple. I'm the executive director at the Old State House, and we teach civics and history, and this is great.
I'm Valeriano Ramos with Everyday Democracy. I'm also a professional musician as well.
Mike Ferentz, I'm a support aide at a special education school in Fairfield County.
Welcome.
Mike Rocathy, retired municipal employee, and now just enjoying life.
Good for you. I'm glad at least 1 in 10 enjoys life.
Kim Morehart, I'm retired from career and education, and I'm enjoying life with him.
I'm glad he's not the only one enjoying. Well, thank you. You know who I am, at least at some levels. That was the, what do you call, whitewashed edition, the clinical one. I'm glad you don't know me otherwise. So I, in the interest of 30 minutes?
30 minutes.
30 minutes. In the interest of making the best use of our 30 minutes, I want us to kind of explore one or two ideas. And the first question I'd like to ask you is, if you were living in China or Saudi Arabia, let's just assume you were, what about a democracy would you miss most? I don't mean theoretically, as a personal, your everyday life, and it has to be personal. Personally, what would you miss? Okay, not about America, about living in a democracy. Anybody? Yes.
Just having freedom to say what you want and go where you want.
Freedom to say what you want and go where you want, okay? Can I, because this is something that we all in America is very common, speak from the I, from your personal experience. I would not like the idea that I can't be free. Whatever. I want us to be really talking from a personal I standpoint. Anybody else?
I think I'd miss the diversity. Not so much India or China. I haven't been there, but I've been to Italy. And after about a week, I remember thinking one time, everyone here is Italian. No one else.
Right.
Italian or gypsies, but they're very discriminated against.
Okay.
I think I'd miss that.
Okay. Right.
I would miss diversity too, and also the freedom of expression and all disagreeing with government to be able to disagree.
I rent an apartment to a graduate student from Saudi Arabia. And I'm a little torn right now, only because I get a chance to talk to him a lot. Very engaging young man, wonderful young man. And it's very interesting to listen to him speak about his time in Saudi Arabia in terms of, he's been educated here in the United States from university level and then graduate level. He's very, very happy in Saudi Arabia. And a lot of it, he talks a lot about the belonging, so a great deal of belonging, and his needs are cared for. He's part of that vision, you know, the king's, the prince's vision. And so it's very hard. I mean, given your druthers, he's seen America.
Right.
He is anxious to go back to Saudi Arabia. So, you know, I kind of, can't help but respect that. And what exactly is it? Of course, family's strong.
Right.
That's
Absolutely.
a strong component. It values the family, whatnot. So, you know, we begin to think that America is everything.
Oh,
but
it isn't.
It isn't. Yeah. Yeah.
As a foreigner, I can say that. But thank you so much for saying that, because it underscores a very important thing. You don't need democracy to be happy. This is very important. Democracy is not the only system. There are many other systems. Now, having lived in parts of the Middle East, as a foreigner, my experience is, I speak from the I, that if I don't belong to the dominant group, I cannot be happy. I can't feel safe. I don't have my rights. But if, and this is true in any, even the most oppressive system, the people who are aligned to the dominant group are usually happy because they have the kind of advantages others don't. So 100 years ago, a small minority of Brahmins in India were very happy because they were on top. 98% of Indians were not on top and were discriminated against. So I think there are two issues I'd like to separate. One, the fact that you don't need democracy to be happy. You can be the dictator's daughter and be very happy, or a distant cousin, or a member of that religious group. If you are a Sunni in Saudi Arabia, you're likely to be more happy than if you're a Shia. So I guess I just want to put that. But let's just put it another way. I've done a lot of work with Muslim and Hindu and Christian fundamentalists. I've done multi-year dialogues with them. And one of the things I've realized is, particularly the more fundamental a person is, the less inclined they are towards living in a democracy. My Muslim fundamentalist friends, and now I say they're friends because I've been working with them for 4 years, that I know them very well and they trust me completely. They are contemptuous of democracy, particularly contemptuous of America. They say that system has failed, your families have disappeared, your communities have broken down, that is not the way society should be. And they would rather, when I show them what has happened to Arabs or Muslim societies, they say, no, but that's not the real Islamic society. The real Islamic society would be perfect. So I'm just putting it out there to say that for someone who believes in a monochromatic and monocultural society, any diversity is threatening unless you can suppress dissent. So, but thank you for raising that, because that's an important part of how we understand democracy itself. I think a lot of people, just one more thing, people expect to be happy in a democracy. No, it's hard work to be in a democracy.
I think it's fun teaching children to stand up for what things that they think are important to them in their age group, and little items and a process in which you go about researching it and communicating it and going to your, group sessions to talk about things, to come out with solutions that are better than what may be there now.
So can I?
So I've always been that kind of chief person to, promote the militants.
And I think in a society like this, you can do that. because it's encouraged
Right.
up to a point.
Right.
You try to do that in another society,
Right.
you won't insist.
Right.
And I think that's one of the wonderful things about democracy. It allows for assertiveness, particularly from a minority. So there are people who don't want you to have that right here, and who are threatened by that, and then we have to deal with that. So, but coming back to China or Saudi Arabia, what would you miss?
I would miss the freedom of my way of dressing.
Dressing, right. Saudi Arabia particularly, you would have to cover yourself, right? Of course, even if you're a foreigner.
Yeah.
I was going to say something very similar to what you said. I would miss, because we work with teaching children to find their voice and how to speak up and how to be informed. I would miss just the looks on kids' faces when they understand the power that they have. That would be a horrible thing to be without.
Wonderful, wonderful. Anybody else?
I miss my rights as a woman, my total rights as a woman.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Going out of the house by myself.
Right. And it's only when you don't have that that you realize how much you have here. Because when you're here, you're very conscious of what you don't have here. And there's no reason you shouldn't aspire to push the boundaries. Of course you can, but I think in the process sometimes we don't even recognize what we have. And the problem with that is, if we adopt strategies that make the whole society more vulnerable, even the rights that we have can be gone. Here's something else, no rights that we have can be taken for granted. They are all in a particular time and place. The laws can be changed. Even if the laws are not changed, the people can disregard the laws. And they can, and African Americans know this more than anyone else, right? So the trick is, how do you, this is the balance, how much do you fight for rights? And how much do you preserve a system that allows you to fight for rights? Because if you fight for rights too much, the system can become so unwieldy and collapse. And here's the thing, when systems collapse, historically, when systems collapse, it results in order, in chaos. Chaos usually ends up with despotism or tyranny. In other words, when there is chaos, remember, why did human beings develop government in the first place? For security. Chaos means no security. Anarchism. And in that situation, we all look for strong leaders to come in there, step up, and clean the mess, drain the swamp, put everybody who's a troublemaker in prison, or throw them out of the country. That is the death of democracy. So one of the things that and only recently, in the last couple of years, become very conscious is, democracy is a balancing act. Balancing between what I want and what you need. What my ideas of reality are, my ideas of values and a good life, and what your ideas are. My ideas of how much I can fight, and my ideas of how much the other person can also fight, and how do I know when to stop fighting? How do I know when to retreat strategically so that tomorrow I can come back and do it? It's a balance. There is no clear, okay, so the best example for me is, and I say this only because I've worked with Muslims for so long, they believe that the solutions are there in the Quran. And if not in the Quran, the hadiths, which are the interpretations of the Quran. They believe everything that human beings want is there. Democracy, no constitution can have that. Democracy is primarily a process. And that process allows us to negotiate and dialogue and work the system in order to get what we want. There is no holy book. And seeing the Constitution as a holy book is also problematic. Constitution is merely a kind of a structure, guideline. It is not the word of God. Thank goodness. Because God never accounted for Facebook. You know, really. I think if God had an idea that Facebook would happen, he probably would have expelled Zuckerberg in the first sentence from Harvard.
They'd have a lot of followers.
Huh?
They'd have a lot
I
of
can tell you
followers.
love Facebook.
God would have more followers.
A lot of likes.
He would have invented Facebook himself. Actually, God book. Okay. Any other last thoughts on that? On what you would miss if you were not living in a democratic society?
I think that everybody's just kind of touched on it, but the personal choices that you can make for yourself, you know, as belonging to certain groups, organizations, and choices with medical decisions, and again, the kind of choices that you make, as you said, religion choices.
Right.
Your personal, you know, choices. So just would, I don't believe in China exists. You as a human, your humanity is thought of very differently. You as a person is thought of very differently.
Thank you so much.
Especially when somebody controls your food.
Right, right,
What
right.
you do and do not eat, and
Right.
whether you even have food to
Right.
eat.
Like, for instance, in Dubai during Ramadan, I was not allowed to walk, to be seen in public eating anything during the day or even taking a sip of water. That is a serious infringement of my individual rights. What Dubai and China and Saudi have no dearth of a choice of toothpaste, choice of brands, because these are kind of like air-conditioned malls. But what they don't have is what you're talking about, the capacity to make individual choices in almost every realm or sphere of our lives. Very important, right? So, I'm going to ask you a question that will require you to just ponder for a moment. I want you to identify the kind of promises that democracy has kept in your life. When you look at having lived in the US or any other country for a long time or all your life, what are some of the promises democracy has kept? And what are some of the ways in which democracy has not kept those promises or has betrayed those promises? Now, I'm going to give you a minute to just ponder on it. So on one side, I want you to talk about the promises that your democratic system has kept. Not talking of government. Specific, don't say, well, the Obama administration or the Bush administration. No, as a system. Okay, what are some of the promises that were kept? What are some of the promises that were not kept, or ways in which the democratic system betrayed you? Okay? I'll give you a minute.
One for me personally, it has kept the opportunity for people to creatively think, write, express themselves in whatever form is best in their development, whether it be music, whether it be art, whether it be literature, whether it be science, you can choose to develop in any ways you want, and there are free places to go to learn.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let's just do the promises first, and then we go around and hear the broken promises. So who else would like to share? Yes.
Promise for change.
Promise,
Changing.
the possibility of change.
Yeah.
Right. Good.
Opportunities for economic success, for learning, for achieving goals.
Opportunity, not the guarantee of it.
No guarantee.
I've been able to make any decisions in my life, whether good or bad.
Right.
No one told me to make. I wasn't dictated.
Wonderful, wonderful. This is very linked with what you were talking about.
As a parent, I have the freedom to bring my child up to have the learning in whatever capacity that meant, whether it's travel or schools or unencumbered, really, other than my own economic situation or whatever. Yeah.
You didn't have a visit from a government officer or a clergyman telling you how to raise your children. And that's not something you can take for granted. In most societies, you do get that.
I think freedom to disagree for me.
The freedom to disagree. Right. Anybody else? Yes.
Also, it's promised a certain amount of order in this society. To live with my neighbors and things like that, and safety. It's promised me some of that.
Absolutely.
Maybe not to the degree in all cases.
Right.
But it has afforded me some safety.
Right. If you just want to know how lucky you folks are that you have some safety and order, try driving in India. Oh, walking in India. Why drive? Others.
I'd say the freedom to advocate for myself in the world that I'd like to see.
And to be able to talk about it the next day.
Yes.
Kind of going off the disagreeing and advocating, I've been lucky enough since I was a small child to be able to go and protest governments when I disagree. I was at dozens of anti-Iraq war protests back in the day, and I was at the Women's March in DC and the Women's March in Hartford this past year. And I've had the chance to kind of see all of these different ways that we as or in a democracy are allowed to kind of say, I don't like how this government is going to function or is functioning or what's going on, and I don't have to worry about being arrested.
And if you are arrested, as happened to a friend of mine who was in the anti-war protests in 2003, I think, he fought it all the way to the Supreme Court and won. And he was fighting the Secret Service that arrested him. So this is astonishing. And here's the amazing thing. He's a brown-skinned person of Indian origins. He was born in the US, so he's an American citizen through and through, but a brown-skinned, bearded Indian who was arrested, and in a time when the Patriot Act was in effect, he fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, and he won against the Secret Service, which is, you can't see an example like that anywhere else in the world, with the Patriot Act. So that's what gives me hope. That's what gives me hope. Which is not to say there are so many things that must change. Not making this as an excuse that I'm never going to even imply that things are even halfway okay. No, but there are some amazing things we need to recognize. So what else? Anybody else?
I think one of the things we're promised is struggle, the struggle to, like you've been talking about, balance and all of those things. And for some reason, I just keep thinking of an exhibit that's at the Smithsonian now about democracy. And I think about walking through that exhibit and all of the different artifacts they had back from the birth of the nation up until protests in the 60s and up until things happening today. And just to see that whole spread of history and that constant struggle that Americans have had to move forward, and sometimes they go backwards. But when I went to that exhibit, I had a great sense of pride in the struggle that democracy has promised us.
Is that exhibit still on, and is it in DC?
Yeah, it's in DC in the National Museum of Natural History, and actually there's a Connecticut artifact in it. There are a few of them. But one is a millstone that was from Devil's Hop Yard in East Haddam, which was owned by a man who was actually a loyalist and who was pretty much terrorized by the Patriots. So it is a really interesting piece of history that reminds you of all the different sides we've taken.
Thank you.
There is a museum of Route 44. It's the Tort Law Museum.
Interesting.
And all the feuds and why all these tort laws came into existence. And it goes back to about the 1600s.
Wow.
When people were establishing homes and land and differences in family and the reason we have our legal system.
Exactly. Again, back to rule of law. And law is an organic thing that develops. Every society builds its own. Right. So now, very conscious of time, and I don't want to impose unduly on anyone. Last question before a checkout. And the last question is, and again, personal, purely personal. And by that I mean, I want you to really ask yourself honestly how you would answer this. What are you willing to sacrifice to preserve your own rights and freedoms? I don't want a MLK speech or a Lincoln speech. I just want to ask you what you personally would sacrifice. And for not an abstract set of freedoms or rights, the ones that you value and the ones that you have now. And I'd like to hear from everyone, if you don't mind.
I think there will be several, but one would be the idea that I'm always right, that I have to be willing to say, you know, I could be wrong, and I need to hear the other person's point of view. I would be willing to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we go this way?
I haven't thought of
Okay, don't worry. So,
I guess thinking that, you know, I can get everything I want. You know, I have certain things, certain laws I'd like to see passed, certain ways a government should behave, and I have to be able to, like, accept that that's just not the way it is. There's many different ideas in this country. There's many different political beliefs, and I can't get everything I want just because I think it might be what's best.
thank you.
Still thinking.
Good. We'll come back. The still thinking people, I know who you are. One of the advantages of a small group.
I guess I would do some of the things I'm still doing is that, again, I joined a group to protest some of the things that I oppose. And
I'm asking for things you would sacrifice, not things you will do.
it's my time.
Okay, so absolutely. I would be willing to give more of my time.
I'm retired and I give my time.
Yeah, for me,
Thank you.
it would be the time.
Would be also time.
Time.
Which is why you showed up here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you.
I would say like losing other like friends or people who don't agree with me or just can't compromise. But if I would want to compromise for other people or be interconnected and actually have that interdependence, like I would rather fight for that.
Fight for the
than-
interdependence.
Yes, then just then not compromise, but just be one-sided and just only cater or accommodate for only one view only, whether it's a friend or family. I would be willing to.
Good. And you do realize the cost of that. You will alienate people who see you as betraying them. So that even being open-minded, there's a cost to it.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of going along that line, I would give up a lot, I think, to maintain even long-term the freedoms that
So
we
tell us what you would give up.
the idea that
Be specific.
I'm not going to, I'm sorry. The idea I keep coming to is that, like, we've gotten to this place in our democracy and in our society where we do have a lot of freedoms and a lot of like privileges, and I have lived a very privileged life, and I did that because of the people that have come before me, and because we've stood on the backs of a lot of people to get to where we are, and I would return that favor.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, you.
It wasn't specific, sorry.
it was better than specific. You were very clear about it. Thank you. Sally, and you? And you?
I would say time.
Time.
To say time.
There's a premium on time right now, so that's a huge thing.
Just because of the week I've had, I would say, because I work for an organization that's working toward helping people understand democracy, and I work all the time, that I give up other things that I love in order to work to this end.
And remember, that's only for a period of time in your life.
Yeah.
You know, people that are older, you know, they look back on that and they say, yeah, I miss these, I miss that, I miss this. But in some people are no longer living that you can even have spent the time with. So you have to say to yourself, you know, how do I carve out this personal time?
Thank you.
I'm willing to give up some long-held beliefs. I don't know if it even borders on values. I know that Mike and I often challenge each other. We talk a lot about what's going on everywhere. And he'll say something to me that will bring me up short. And of course, I want to win.
Who doesn't?
So I've had to learn to kind of step back and go, wow, you know, especially the things that feel really deep-seated and whatnot. So I think it's that whole educational component of being vulnerable again. Give up what you think was really part of the fabric of who you are and look at it another way.
Thank you. That was right, yes.
I think in the present Indian situation, I would like to give up my stringent religious beliefs in order to consider or fight for religious equality and not consider my religion to be superior.
That's a huge thing, a very difficult thing if you're a believer. Very difficult thing. Sorry, one of you made a point. What was the point you made? Just remind me. What did you share with the group?
Carving out time for the things
And
that you like and you
right, for your personal,
right.
Right. And yours?
It was the not specific kind of specific thing.
Yes, the freedoms that others have fought for. And I think I just want to literally sum it up for myself as you're privileged. Guess what? Being born in a developing country, not as an upper caste person, not as from a wealthy family, I was extraordinarily privileged. It may be difficult for Americans to believe this, but India is more color discriminatory than the US is. Absolutely. When a baby is born, the first thing that they look is the color. And when I was growing up, I was told, it's okay that you're black, provided you get a good education and you top your class. If you get a good job and you're successful, being black is okay. That's the message I got as a 7 and 8 year old. Okay? But here's the thing, with all that, I consider myself extraordinarily privileged because I could fight all of that in India because it was a democracy. And I didn't fight for the democracy. My previous generations fought for it so that I could be privileged. And here's what I'm most concerned about. My nephews and my nieces and the next generation will not have it. Unless my generation keeps fighting for it today. And the problem is, and another reason why I left India, I don't see enough people worrying about this. As long as the economy is doing well, and Indian economy has been doing phenomenally well for 25 years, 25 years, 35 years, no, 25, anyway, my math. And as long as we can buy the best cars and the best clothes and the best electronics in the world, and we can be connected with high-speed internet, nobody cares what freedoms and rights they have. And this is an extraordinarily dangerous thing. My whole family, and I said we were not wealthy, but my family was privileged because we are 4th generation college going in a poor country. 4th generation college going. In the US that would be a big deal, but in India we have that. Today, when I ask even my next generation, which means I have cousins who are 15 years younger than me, and I have nephews who are, in their early 20s or late teens, not one of them is willing to lift this much of a little finger in order to protect
the political system. They're willing to fight for their rights. Don't get me wrong. If they don't get something, they will fight for it. That's different from protecting the larger system that allows you the right to fight for it. And many of them will not even fight for their rights. They will sit quietly, provided they're doing well economically. This is heartbreaking. My own family. You going to say something?
We have to.
We have to. So, can I just do one checkout?
We have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. So, 10 seconds a person. I would love to have a quick checkout. And before that, I'll take 10 seconds to say, please keep in touch. I'm trying to do this out of DC. If there's any way I can support the activities you're doing, no matter what the group is, call me. Val has my thing. I have a few cards I can give before you leave. Quick checkout. What's your gut sense about this evening? Gut sense about this evening. I don't want to put pressure on her. Anyone can start.
I'm not terrified. I feel inspired.
I failed. I want to terrify you.
A lot of
Thank you.
motivation.
Sorry?
Motivation.
Motivation.
New understanding.
New understanding.
Yeah.
New perspective.
New perspective. New understanding. Right? Knowledge. Hope. All the words that I didn't really want to inspire. Darn.
Yeah, I definitely want to get more of the people in my life more involved and actually participate and have them acknowledge that, because people like it when you were mentioning social media, people were just constantly letting off steam temporarily, and they think they did something. And in reality, if they did nothing. And it's just a cycle where people just see something upsetting on the news or, something going on, like, in the street. Yeah.
I need to stop. But thank you. Great thought. Those I haven't heard from. Quick, before he throws it out of here.
I think
Yeah, I think we have to.
Okay.
Or they kick us out.
Thank you very much.
Before that, you're going to receive an email with a link to the survey to tell us how useful this was, what you got out of it. And I do want to, again, thank you, Ashok, for inspiring, really powerful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.